The courthouse in downtown Springfield, Missouri, was packed beyond capacity that Wednesday morning. Reporters lined the marble hallways, cameras hanging heavy from their shoulders, waiting for anything that might turn this trial into a national headline. Inside the main courtroom, every seat was filled, the overflow crowd forced to stand against the walls. Court officers had long since given up trying to maintain order among the restless spectators. It wasn't every day that a small Midwestern town found itself at the center of a case so charged, so ugly, and so deeply personal. At the center of it all sat Raymond Ray Haskins, the accused. His name alone had become enough to divide the town into camps. To some, he was a man wrongfully accused, a victim of circumstance and overzealous prosecution. To others, he was a predator whose guilt was written in every arrogant glance he cast toward the jury box. The charges were grim: aggravated assault, attempted kidnapping, and battery. The community was already raw from months of speculation, rumor, and late-night talk show segments. Ray leaned back in his chair that morning, dressed in a gray suit that fit too snugly, his hands clasped on the table as if in prayer. But his expression betrayed no reverence. He watched the proceedings with the air of a man who still believed he was smarter than everyone else in the room. The public defender at his side scribbled notes, whispering strategy, but Ray's eyes were fixed instead on the judge, the jury, and every so often, the press row. He knew this wasn't just a trial. It was theater. Judge Harmon entered promptly at 9, his black robe flowing as he ascended the bench. He was a man with a reputation for fairness, but not patience, and his gavel strikes were known to echo like cannon fire when the courtroom tested him. "This court is now in session," he announced, his deep voice cutting through the chatter. A hush spread across the room, though not without difficulty. The prosecution team was ready, their files stacked neatly, witnesses prepped and waiting. Lead prosecutor Dana Cole adjusted her glasses, glanced once at the jury, and then looked down at her notes. She was seasoned, respected, and not easily rattled. Yet, as the morning unfolded, even she found herself caught off guard. The first few motions of the day passed without incident: legal wrangling over admissibility of evidence, procedural complaints from the defense, objections met with the judge's weary sigh. The jury sat stoically, some leaning forward, others scribbling in notebooks provided by the court. It was the familiar rhythm of trial work, slow, grinding, deliberate. But beneath that rhythm, tension hummed like a wire, pulled taut. And the double doors at the rear of the courtroom opened. Every head turned, though no one was sure why at first. A bailiff stepped aside, and into the crowded chamber came a woman carrying a child. She was young, perhaps late 20s, with tired eyes and a protective hold on the little girl in her arms. The girl couldn't have been more than 3. She clutched a stuffed rabbit so warm it seemed to be losing its shape, her thumb tucked firmly in her mouth. The sight was jarring. A child in this courtroom? In this trial? Murmurs rippled instantly across the gallery. Even the jurors stirred, exchanging curious glances. It was like watching a fire break out silently in the room. The presence of that tiny figure disrupted everything. Judge Harmon's eyebrows arched. He leaned forward slightly, his gavel resting in his hand. "Bailiff," he said sternly, "what is the meaning of this?" The bailiff cleared his throat. "Your Honor, the prosecution requested the presence of the witness and her guardian. This is her." The silence that followed was profound. Dana Cole rose from her seat. "Your Honor, the child is here under protective supervision. We ask that her guardian remain at her side at all times. We will address her role at the appropriate moment." The defense attorney shot up from his chair. "This is outrageous. She's a toddler, for God's sake. You're parading a child into this courtroom to prejudice the jury. This is theater, not justice." His words carried a sneer that matched the smirk spreading across Ray Haskins's face. The judge's gavel cracked once. "Sit down, Mr. Langford. I'll decide what constitutes justice in this courtroom." "Proceed, Miss Cole." But even as the legal argument simmered, the focus of everyone in that chamber remained fixed on the little girl. She wore a yellow dress with a crooked bow at the back, her curly hair tied up haphazardly, as though she had dressed in a hurry that morning. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, swept across the room without fear. She looked at the judge, the jury, and finally, the defendant. Her thumb slipped from her mouth. Ray Haskins shifted in his seat. For the first time all morning, his smirk faltered. He crossed one leg over the other and tapped his shoe nervously against the floor. His attorney leaned toward him, whispering something urgent, but Ray's eyes stayed locked on the child. The atmosphere thickened. Even seasoned reporters, who had covered everything from corruption scandals to grisly murder cases, found themselves leaning forward, pens hovering above paper. They sensed something unusual was about to unfold. The German Shepherd K9, stationed near the witness stand, raised his head. Until then, the dog had been lying flat, silent and obedient. Now his ears pricked up. His gaze followed the child intently. The handler tightened his grip on the leash, puzzled. The dog wasn't behaving aggressively. Not yet, but there was a shift, subtle but undeniable. It was as if the animal had recognized something unseen by human eyes. Whispers spread like wildfire. "Why is she here?" Someone hissed from the gallery. Another spectator muttered, "They can't seriously expect her to testify, can they?" A juror coughed nervously, breaking the tension for only a moment before the silence returned, heavier than before. The guardian, sensing the room's weight, adjusted the child on her hip and approached the front of the courtroom as directed. She stood just behind the prosecution's table, avoiding eye contact with the defense. The little girl squirmed slightly, tugging at the ear of her stuffed rabbit, but her eyes never wavered from the German Shepherd. The judge exhaled slowly, his patience tested. "Miss Cole, explain this to me." "Now," the prosecutor cleared her throat. "Your Honor, the child was present at a critical moment during the incident. Her recollection, limited though it may be, could be significant. We understand her age complicates matters, but the presence of the court's K9 unit provides an additional safeguard. The jury deserves to hear what she knows." The defense attorney laughed aloud, a sharp, ugly sound. "What she knows? She's 3. She knows cartoons and bedtime stories." This is absurd. But the laughter died quickly, because at that very moment, the little girl lifted her head, pulled the rabbit close, and stared straight at Ray Haskins. Her lips parted slightly, as though she recognized him. Ray froze, and the German Shepherd, without a sound, rose to his feet. The German Shepherd, a muscular animal with a coat the color of burnished bronze, shifted his weight onto his paws. His handler, Officer Marcus Reed, immediately felt the pull on the leash and frowned. For months, the dog had been the picture of discipline. In courtrooms, at crime scenes, during tense standoffs, he never moved unless given a command. But now, without so much as a sound, he had risen. His amber eyes locked onto the smallest figure in the room, the 3-year-old girl. "Officer, Reed had worked with Thor for nearly 5 years. The dog had been trained in narcotics detection, search and rescue, and suspect apprehension. But more than that, Thor was known for his steadiness, his uncanny sense of danger. Reed often said the animal could read people better than most cops. And as the little girl adjusted her stuffed rabbit and looked across the courtroom, Thor's ears twitched, his nostrils flared, and his tail lowered into a slow, deliberate sway. It was a posture Reed recognized. The dog wasn't reacting to distraction. He was recognizing something. The jurors noticed. 12 pairs of eyes, once indifferent, now darted between the girl and the dog. Juror number 7, a retired librarian, scribbled something quickly in her notebook. Juror number 3, a truck driver with sun-leathered skin, leaned forward, elbows on his knees. The atmosphere, already strained, thickened with each passing second of silence. Ray Haskins, the defendant, squirmed in his chair. He had cultivated a mask of smug indifference throughout the trial, but that mask cracked now. His smirk faltered as he glanced at the dog. The German shepherd didn't blink. He didn't growl. He didn't bark. He simply stared, his gaze unyielding, as though he were reading the soul of the man across the aisle. The defense attorney, Langford, noticed too. He tugged at his collar, his face flushing. "Your Honor," he said quickly, his voice pitched higher than usual, "this spectacle is a distraction. A dog staring at my client isn't evidence. Nor is this child's presence anything but a ploy to sway the jury emotionally." "I demand, sit down, Mr. Langford," Judge Harmon interrupted, voice like granite. "The court will determine what is relevant." He turned his attention back to the prosecution. "Ms. Cole, proceed carefully." "Very carefully." Dana Cole nodded, her hand steady, but her pulse quickened. She knew the risks of bringing the child into the courtroom. She knew how it could backfire. But she also knew something the defense didn't, that Thor had been part of the earliest stages of this investigation. The dog had been present the night officers responded to the crime scene. And on that night, amid the chaos and blood and confusion, a toddler had whispered 2 simple words that had made Thor's ears shoot up exactly as they did now. But Cole couldn't say that yet. Timing was everything. The truth, to have its full weight, had to arrive when the jury was ready. Meanwhile, the gallery buzzed. Reporters leaned over to whisper to one another. A local news anchor whispered, "Did you see that? The dog is reacting to her." A cameraman, scribbling notes in the absence of allowed equipment, muttered, "This trial just got interesting." The guardian carrying the child shifted uncomfortably under the stairs. She hadn't wanted to bring the girl into this room. She had begged the prosecutor to find another way. But the prosecutor had been insistent. Sometimes the most unlikely witnesses turned out to be the most powerful. And as the little girl looked around with wide eyes, she seemed oddly unbothered by the sea of adults watching her every move. What mattered to her, it seemed, was the dog. The little girl wriggled until her guardian set her down gently on the floor. She toddled forward on tiny legs, clutching the rabbit in one hand. Gasps echoed as she approached the dog. Thor's body stiffened, muscles taut, but he didn't growl. He stood perfectly still, his eyes following her every step. When she stopped directly in front of him, the room collectively held its breath. The dog lowered his head, sniffing once. The handler gripped the leash tighter, ready to pull him back if necessary. But Thor didn't lunge. He didn't bark. He simply stood tall, head tilted slightly, as if listening for a sound only he could hear. The little girl tilted her head back in the same way, mirroring him unconsciously. It was uncanny, the symmetry between the child and the beast. A juror muttered under his breath, "Well, I'll be damned." His neighbor elbowed him sharply, but the thought was shared by many. This was no ordinary courtroom moment. Something unseen was passing between the child and the dog. "Order!" Judge Harmon barked, though he too looked unsettled. "The jury will disregard any behavior not officially entered into testimony." But his words lacked force. Everyone knew the jury couldn't unsee what they had just witnessed. Langford rose again, flustered. "This is ridiculous. Dogs can't testify. Children this young can't testify. This is nothing but theater to bias the jury against my client. I move for a mistrial." The judge's gavel cracked against wood. "Sit down, counselor." Motion denied. He turned to the handler. "Officer Reed, keep control of your animal." "Yes, Your Honor," Reed said firmly, but his eyes never left Thor. He wasn't sure control was the right word. Thor wasn't misbehaving. Thor was working. The prosecutor rose slowly. Your Honor, with the court's permission, we request a brief recess before proceeding. The child needs a moment. Judge Harmon studied her face, then nodded reluctantly. 5 minutes. Do not waste my time. The bailiff escorted the guardian and the girl to a bench at the side of the courtroom. The little girl sat with her stuffed rabbit, swinging her legs back and forth, utterly oblivious to the storm she had just created. To her, it was nothing extraordinary. She was simply here, in a big room, with a big dog who seemed to know her. But to everyone else, the jury, the lawyers, the press, her presence was a thunderclap. And though no words had been spoken yet, the tension had doubled. The dog's watchfulness was more eloquent than testimony. His unwavering stare at Ray Haskins was a silent accusation, one no lawyer could easily cross-dash. Examined. Ray shifted again, this time more violently. He leaned close to Langford, whispering something heated. His attorney hushed him, gesturing sharply to calm down. But the damage was visible. The jury had seen him sweat. They had seen his composure slip, and Thor hadn't looked away once. When the recess ended, and the judge ordered everyone back to order, the dog remained in the same position, standing tall, eyes locked forward, body tense. The little girl, now back in her guardian's lap, kept glancing toward him, as though the two were connected by an invisible thread. No one knew what would happen next. But everyone knew something had changed. The stage was set. And in the silence of that packed courtroom, a German shepherd's gaze spoke louder than any lawyer's words. Defense attorney Gerald Langford rose with the slow swagger of a man convinced he already owned the room. His navy suit, too sharp for the town's modest setting, gleamed under the fluorescent lights. He tugged once at his cufflinks, smoothed his tie, and faced the jury with a smile that seemed rehearsed in the mirror that very morning. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, voice dripping with confidence, let's not lose our heads here. We are gathered in this courthouse to weigh evidence, to apply reason, and to reach a verdict based on facts. Facts, not feelings. Yet look where we are already. He gestured broadly toward the prosecution's table, where the guardian sat with the child on her lap. The girl looked small against the towering oak benches, her rabbit dangling by one ear, but Langford pointed as if she were a grown adult taking the stand. A 3-year-old, he scoffed. 3 years old. Do we seriously believe this child can offer any kind of credible testimony? She cannot even spell her own name. Murmurs stirred in the gallery. Langford pressed forward, feeding on the sound of agreement. She lives in a world of cartoons and nap times. Yet the prosecution wants you to think she's the linchpin of this entire case. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not justice, it's theater. He smirked, turning slightly toward the press row, as though already savoring the headlines he hoped they'd write. Then he delivered the line he had clearly rehearsed. If we are to take bedtime stories as testimony, we may as well put the rabbit on the stand. Laughter rippled through parts of the courtroom, nervous and brief. The judge's gavel cracked sharply. Order, Mr. Langford, control your tone. Langford bowed slightly. Of course, Your Honor, but the point remains. This is a desperate stunt. My client cannot be convicted based on the whims of a toddler. The law requires proof, not playground chatter. At the defense table, Ray Haskins allowed himself a crooked grin. His eyes flicked toward the jury, gauging reactions, as though Langford's performance had given him back some control. He leaned back, tapping his fingers on the table, confidence seeping slowly back into his posture. But on the other side of the aisle, Prosecutor Donna Cole was already on her feet. She stood with quiet composure, adjusting her glasses as the room calmed. Your Honor, the defense paints this as a circus, but let us not forget. This child was present at the scene. She was not planted, not coached, she was there. She saw things others missed. And while her age complicates matters, it does not erase the truth she carries. Her voice was steady, each word measured, but her eyes burned with conviction. She turned to the jury. We don't ask you to treat her like an adult witness. We ask you to recognize that innocence sometimes speaks with more clarity than cynicism. And if her presence unsettles the defendant, perhaps you should ask yourselves why. That last line landed like a stone in still water. Jurors shifted uneasily. Several pairs of eyes drifted toward Ray Haskins, who sat with his grin frozen mid-expression, his jaw tightening. Judge Harmon leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. Both arguments noted. The child will remain for now. This court will determine her relevance when the time comes. He paused, gaze sweeping the room. And let us remember, the jury will decide what weight, if any, to give her presence. The gavel struck once, sealing the matter for now. But the tension did not ease. The girl, oblivious to the verbal sparring, swung her rabbit back and forth, watching it bounce against her knees. Yet every so often, her eyes drifted toward the defendant. She studied him with the same quiet curiosity a child might give a stranger in a supermarket aisle. Only this time, the stranger avoided her gaze. The canine Thor hadn't moved. He stood rooted beside his handler, eyes never leaving Ray. The room had noticed it earlier, but now it was impossible to ignore. Even Langford, for all his bravado, kept glancing nervously at the dog. Officer Reed tightened his grip on the leash, but not to pull the dog back. He knew Thor wasn't misbehaving. This was intent. The dog wasn't distracted. He was locked in, responding to something primal. Reed had seen it before, on dark nights when suspects lied through their teeth until Thor's growl made them break. He felt a chill run up his spine. Juror number 5 scribbled furiously in her notebook. Juror number 9 rubbed the back of his neck, exchanging a quick glance with his neighbor. The jury box was no longer impassive. The defense's dismissal of the child had not landed as intended. Instead of ridicule, it had raised suspicion. The gallery whispered, though hushed tones were quickly met with warnings from the bailiffs. Reporters leaned over their notepads, already sketching out leads for their midday updates. Child witness draws courtroom divide. Defense mocks girl. Canine reacts. The story was writing itself, and in the middle of it all sat Ray Haskins, shifting in his seat, the smug mask wearing thin. He leaned close to Langford, muttering something harsh. Langford nodded quickly, but his eyes flicked nervously toward Thor again, betraying doubt he hadn't shown a moment earlier. Donna Cole observed it all. She let the silence linger, knowing sometimes silence was louder than words. She didn't need theatrics. She had a child who looked at the defendant with innocent eyes, and a dog who refused to look away. That was theater enough. Finally, the judge cleared his throat. The court will proceed. Miss Cole, call your next witness. The prosecutor nodded, but before she could speak, the little girl stirred. She leaned forward, tugged gently at her guardian's sleeve, and whispered something inaudible. The guardian bent down, listening, then froze. Her eyes widened, flicking nervously toward the prosecution. The dog's ears twitched. Thor lowered his body slightly, muscles coiled. Officer Reed tensed instantly, sensing the shift. He had seen it too many times. The dog was preparing for something. The courtroom, unaware of the specifics, felt the energy change. It was as though the air itself had grown heavier, pressing against their chests. A woman in the gallery fanned herself with a folded program. A man coughed loudly, just to break the silence. Langford, oblivious, pressed on with his earlier point. Your Honor, I must insist again that this charade be ended. This child cannot. But he was cut off, not by the judge, nor the prosecution. but by the sound of Thor's claws scraping against the polished wooden floor. Dog had stepped forward. Ray Haskins jolted back in his chair, eyes wide. His hands gripped the table so tightly, his knuckles whitened. Sweat glistened on his temple. Jurors gasped. The judge banged his gavel furiously. "Order! Officer Reed, restrain your animal." Reed pulled the leash taut, but Thor remained rigid, his gaze burning into Ray. The little girl clutched her rabbit tighter, her wide eyes fixed on the dog, as though she understood what no one else yet did. The room buzzed with panic and confusion, but beneath it all lay a growing realization. Something was building. And it was only a matter of time before the silence broke. The courtroom had grown still, the kind of heavy silence that stretched beyond ordinary pauses in testimony. It was the silence of waiting, of unspoken expectation. The child sat quietly in the witness chair, her tiny shoes dangling inches above the floor. She had been given a small coloring book earlier, but now her crayon rested on the table beside her, forgotten. Her eyes, round, innocent, and yet strangely focused, shifted toward the police dog stationed near the bailiff's desk. The dog, a large sable-colored German shepherd named Rex, had been still for most of the morning. Trained in explosive detection and courtroom security, Rex was accustomed to long hours of sitting patiently. But in that moment, his ears flicked forward, his eyes narrowing, as if he sensed something no one else did. A ripple of unease passed through the gallery as spectators leaned forward. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but Rex's sudden alertness drew attention. The defense attorney, a tall man with sharp cheekbones and an even sharper tongue, was mid-sentence when he stopped. He noticed the jurors' eyes drifting, not to him, not to the defendant, but to the child and the dog. Irritated, he glanced toward the little girl, intending to dismiss her presence with a smirk. That was when she moved, the child's small finger lifted, pointing directly at Rex. For a heartbeat, the gesture seemed meaningless, a child's whimsy, nothing more. But then she leaned closer to the microphone, her voice so soft that it was almost a whisper. Yet the stillness of the room carried it farther than anyone expected. 2 words. Just 2. Spoken in the unpolished, careful tone of a toddler. "Find him." The words rippled through the courtroom like a thunderclap. At first, no one reacted, perhaps not comprehending, perhaps unwilling to believe what they had heard. But Rex reacted. The moment those syllables left the child's lips, the German shepherd's body stiffened. His tail froze, his ears locked forward, and a deep rumble rose from his chest. His handler, Officer Daniels, instinctively tightened the leash, but the dog was already standing, gaze locked with laser precision on one man, the defendant. Gasps filled the gallery. A juror dropped her pen, the sound startlingly loud in the silence. The defendant, a broad-shouldered man with a stone face, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. For weeks he had sat there with a mask of calm defiance. Now, for the first time, a flicker of unease crossed his eyes. The judge banged his gavel sharply, the crack echoing off the marble walls. "Order in the court." His voice carried the stern weight of authority, but even he leaned forward, brows drawn tight. He had been on the bench for 25 years and had seen theatrics of every variety. But never had he seen a 3-year-old command a police canine with such clarity. Prosecutor's face lit up with a mixture of surprise and vindication. She had fought bitterly to allow the child to appear in court, despite the defense's claims that a toddler's presence was a spectacle, not evidence. Now, watching the dog's unmistakable reaction, she felt the tide shifting. "Your Honor," she said quickly, rising from her seat. Let the record reflect the child's statement and the immediate response from the K-9 officer. The defense attorney was already on his feet, red-faced and shouting. "Objection. This is outrageous. She's a child 3 years old." She doesn't even understand what she's saying. This is manipulation of the highest order. But his protest was drowned out by murmurs sweeping through the courtroom. Reporters' pens scratched furiously across notepads. Some spectators covered their mouths in shock. Others exchanged knowing glances, as though the truth had finally cracked open in the most unlikely of ways. Rex strained against his handler's grip, muscles taut, eyes never leaving the defendant. Officer Daniels, beads of sweat forming at his temple, spoke firmly into the dog's ear. "Stay. Stay, Rex." The shepherd obeyed, but his body remained tense, vibrating with energy. A coiled spring waiting for release. The judge rapped his gavel again, louder this time. "Order. I will have order in this court." The room quieted, but the tension did not ease. The air felt thick, charged, as if something irreversible had just occurred. The little girl sat calmly, her finger still pointing toward Rex. She tilted her head, almost curious, as though she didn't understand why everyone seemed so shocked. To her, the words were simple words she had learned somewhere she should never have been. Words connected to a memory too heavy for someone her age to carry. The defense attorney, regaining his composure, tried to spin the moment. "Your Honor, this is nothing but coincidence. A child parrots words she's heard, and a dog, an animal, reacts. You cannot allow this circus act to be mistaken for evidence." But the prosecutor seized the opportunity. "Respectfully, Your Honor, that dog is not just any animal. Rex is a highly trained police canine. He reacts only to specific commands. That child spoke one of them, unprompted. And the defendant's sudden reaction only underscores its weight." The judge frowned, glancing from the child to the dog to the defendant, who now shifted uneasily under the spotlight of suspicion. His fingers clenched around the arms of his chair, knuckles whitening. "Officer Daniels," the judge said firmly, "step forward. Explain your dog's behavior to the court." The handler cleared his throat, moving closer to the bench. "Your Honor, Rex is trained to respond to certain verbal cues. Find him is one such command. When issued, Rex identifies and indicates the person linked to the target scent. For Rex to respond like this, without hesitation, means he believes this individual." He gestured toward the defendant. "Is the one he's been conditioned to locate." The words landed like a gavel strike. The courtroom erupted again, voices rising in disbelief and astonishment. The judge hammered for silence, but the shock lingered, hanging over every juror, every spectator. The defense attorney sputtered, desperate. "This is absurd. Are we now convicting men based on a dog's instincts and the babbling of a child?" The judge silenced him with a glare. "Sit down, counselor. This court will determine the admissibility of what just transpired." Meanwhile, the child blinked innocently, as if unaware of the storm she had unleashed. She reached for her crayon again, scribbling idly on her coloring book. For her, it was just another moment, another phrase. But for everyone else, it was a seismic shift in the trial. A moment that blurred the line between innocence and revelation, between justice and fate. And though no verdict had yet been spoken, the direction of the trial had changed forever. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, whispers, and gasps that ricocheted off the high ceilings. Spectators leaned forward, pressing against the backs of the benches, unable to look away. Cameras flashed. Scribbling pens raced across notepads. The sheer impossibility of what had just occurred seemed to hover in the air. A toddler had spoken 2 words, and a German shepherd had responded as if guided by some invisible force. The tension was electric, palpable, and impossible to ignore. Ray Haskins, the defendant, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His broad shoulders slumped slightly, and the confident smirk he had worn throughout the trial faltered. Beads of sweat dotted his temple, and he clenched his fists on the table. The arrogance he had displayed for months now seemed fragile, cracking under the weight of a moment neither he nor his attorneys could control. Gerald Langford, his defense attorney, scrambled to regain authority. He rose from his chair, pointing a trembling finger at the child. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous. She's a child. She doesn't understand the gravity of what she's saying. And this dog, this animal, cannot be considered evidence." The judge's gavel hit the bench sharply. "Mr. Langford, sit down. You are aware that outbursts like this will not be tolerated." Langford sank back into his chair, muttering under his breath, but his eyes remained fixed on the child and the dog. He could feel the jury's attention slipping from him and onto the scene unfolding before them. A scene he had no control over. Officer Marcus Daniels, the K-9 handler, stepped closer to the judge's bench at the request of the prosecutor. "Your Honor," he said, voice steady, though a bead of sweat ran down his temple. "Rex is trained to respond only to specific commands. The phrase the child spoke is not random. When issued, Rex reacts immediately to identify the individual associated with the target." A wave of gasps spread across the gallery. The jurors exchanged uneasy glances. Some leaned forward, elbows on their knees, faces pale with disbelief. Others whispered to each other, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. The defense table, once a bastion of confidence, now appeared rattled, their composure unraveling before the courtroom. Dana Cole, the lead prosecutor, stood, her voice calm but resonant. "Your Honor, the child's statement was unprompted. She was not coached, and the dog's reaction is consistent with his training. The defendant's visible discomfort only supports the credibility of what has just occurred. I ask that the court formally note both the child's words and the K-9's response in the record." The judge inhaled deeply, fingers steepled in thought. "Very well. The record will reflect the statement and the dog's immediate reaction." Langford slammed his hand on the table. "This is outrageous. You cannot base a case on a child's babbling and an animal's instincts." But even he knew, deep down, that the weight of the courtroom was shifting. The jurors were no longer listening solely to him. Their eyes were on the child, the dog, and the defendant. The gallery's whispers seemed to grow louder, though the bailiffs attempted to maintain order. Rex, meanwhile, had not relaxed. His body was rigid, muscles coiled like a spring. His eyes never left Ray Haskins. Officer Daniels kept the leash taut, but he knew the dog was calm in obedience, not calm in disposition. The animal's training was flawless, but instinct could not be suppressed entirely, and the instinct was screaming at him that something was wrong. The little girl, unaware of the tension she had created, held her rabbit tightly in one hand. Her wide eyes flitted back and forth, curious, observing the reactions around her. To her, it was simply another moment, another phrase, another interaction. Yet the simplicity of her presence had shattered the defense's carefully constructed facade. The judge's gavel struck again, louder this time, attempting to wrest order from chaos. "Order! I will have silence in this courtroom." Slowly, the room quieted, though not entirely. Even in silence, the atmosphere was tense, thick with disbelief. Jurors leaned forward, captivated, unable to avert their eyes from the child or the dog. Spectators pressed closer together, whispers barely contained. Reporters jotted furiously, knowing they were witnessing a moment that would be reported nationwide. Langford whispered sharply to Haskins, attempting to regain composure. "Stay calm. Don't react. Whatever happens, don't react." But Ray's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the table. His jaw clenched, his confidence eroding in real time. He knew that the situation had escalated beyond legal argument. The child and the dog had introduced a new variable, one that no amount of cross-examination could control. Dana Cole rose again, her tone firm, commanding attention. "Your Honor, "May I proceed with the examination?" Judge Harmon nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Proceed carefully. And remember, the court maintains strict decorum." The child shifted slightly in her seat, tugging at her rabbit. Her innocent movements drew even more attention. Thor, the K9, tilted his head slightly, ears alert, eyes fixed. The silent communication between the girl and the dog was visible to everyone, the subtle cues, the unspoken understanding. Spectators leaned forward, sensing that a revelation was imminent. Langford groaned audibly, rubbing his forehead. "Your Honor, I object again. The child is too young. She cannot provide reliable testimony. And the dog's behavior, this is inadmissible." Judge Harmon slammed his gavel, cutting through the rising tension. "Objections noted, Mr. Langford. Sit down. This court will not entertain theatrics disguised as argument." Even with the gavel strike, Langford's protests had sown doubt in the minds of a few jurors, but the larger effect had already taken hold. Eyes were glued to the child and the dog, the defendant caught in a web of scrutiny he could not escape. The air seemed to hum with expectation. Every subtle movement, the shifting of feet, the tightening of hands, the flutter of a page in a notebook felt amplified. A gallery held its breath collectively, as if anticipating the inevitable. Then, the child leaned forward slightly, her small lips parting. The courtroom felt it, a collective stillness descending, so thick that even the hum of the air conditioning seemed deafening. Thor's ears pricked again, his body tensing in perfect alignment with the child's subtle gesture. Ray. Haskins' eyes widened ever so slightly. The first ripple of fear flickered across his expression. He instinctively leaned back, hands gripping the edge of the table, trying to compose himself, but the unease was unmistakable. The defenses of smirk and arrogance crumbled, leaving only raw anxiety. Officer Daniels whispered softly, "Easy, boy, easy." But Thor's posture was rigid, not aggressive, but unflinching. As if demanding truth, the gallery whispered in low tones. The jurors, already leaning forward, now sat at the edges of their seats. Reporters scribbled furiously, the story unfolding faster than it could be recorded. The child's small hand tightened on her rabbit. Though her gaze remained unwavering. It was a slow, deliberate escalation, the kind that freezes hearts. Something was about to happen, and everyone in the room, judge, jury, spectators, defendant, felt it in the hollow of their chests. The moment that could change everything. The moment that had already shifted the balance of justice irreversibly. A judge tapped his gavel twice, a warning to maintain composure. Proceed, but even he knew. Nothing proceeding now would be ordinary. The room was ready for a revelation it had never anticipated. The courtroom had descended into a charged hush, the kind of silence that feels alive. Every movement echoed the creak of benches, the soft shuffle of feet, a subtle rustle of papers. Spectators leaned forward, held in the gravity of the moment. The little girl sat upright, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly in her arms, eyes unwavering. Her gaze was fixed on the German shepherd, who now stood fully alert. Every muscle coiled like a spring. Officer Marcus Daniels held the leash firmly, but with barely contained tension. He had worked with Rex, the K9, for years, and had never witnessed behavior quite like this. The dog's tail was stiff, not wagging, ears forward, nostrils flaring, and jaw slightly parted as if in anticipation. Rex had responded to commands before, but this wasn't obedience. This was instinct, raw, precise, and unrelenting. The jurors were leaning forward now, their notebooks forgotten. Juror number 2, a middle-aged schoolteacher, whispered under her breath, Is the dog?" Her neighbor shook his head, disbelief etched across his face. The entire jury was silent, but their collective unease was palpable. Something extraordinary was happening. something that defied the ordinary boundaries of law and reason. Ray Haskins, the defendant, shifted in his chair. He had remained unerringly composed for weeks, his arrogance like armor. But now the cracks in that armor were visible. His eyes darted between the child and the dog, his jaw tightening. His hands gripped the table, knuckles white. He had seen dogs react to criminals before, in raids and arrests, but never like this, never in a courtroom with a child as catalyst. Fear, raw and uncalculated, flickered across his face. The defense attorney, Gerald Langford, rose again, desperation overtaking his usual bravado. Your Honor, this is absurd. You cannot allow a child to issue commands to an animal and expect it to serve as evidence. This is manipulation. Pure manipulation. Judge Harmon's gavel cracked loudly, cutting through the rising tension. Mr. Langford, sit down. The court will decide what weight, if any, to give this event. You will not interrupt. Langford sank back into his chair, muttering under his breath. He could feel the courtroom's eyes slipping away from him, slipping toward the child and the K-9. His carefully prepared arguments felt fragile now, unable to compete with the spectacle of a toddler and a dog, both holding the attention of everyone in the room. Dana Cole, the prosecutor, stood, hands folded neatly in front of her. Her voice was calm, measured, and commanding. Your Honor, the child has made a statement, unprompted, which directly prompted the dog's behavior. This is not a coincidence. Rex responds only to specific verbal commands, and the child's words triggered an instinctual response. The gallery leaned in, murmurs buzzing like electricity. The reporters scribbled furiously. Spectators craned their necks, straining to see the child and the dog simultaneously. Every pair of eyes in the courtroom seemed magnetically drawn to the duo. Then, the little girl shifted slightly in her seat. Her small voice, soft but clear enough to reach the jury box, broke the heavy silence. Find him. The words, repeated deliberately this time, carried weight far beyond her 3 years. The K-9 reacted instantly. Rex lunged forward against the taut leash, muscles flexing, growl rumbling deep in his chest. Officer Daniels tightened his grip, holding the dog back with all his strength, but Rex was poised, ready to spring. Gasps erupted throughout the courtroom. The gallery vibrated with collective shock. Some spectators whispered prayers under their breath. Jurors leaned forward, some gripping the edge of their benches. Others covered their mouths, trying to process the surreal scene before them. Ray Haskins flinched visibly. His broad shoulders recoiled, his confident mask shattered. For weeks he had maintained composure in court, facing cross-examinations, witness testimony, and media attention without faltering. But now, with a toddler commanding a trained police dog, he looked small, cornered, and utterly exposed. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead as his hands trembled slightly on the table. Langford slammed his palm against the defense table. Objection. This is preposterous. You cannot. Judge Harmon banged the gavel sharply. Order, Mr. Langford. Sit down. The murmurs softened, but did not disappear. Every person in the room felt it, the palpable shift in the courtroom's energy. It was no longer a simple trial. The dynamic had changed. The child and the dog had become central forces, holding truth in a way no lawyer could manipulate or explain away. Dana Cole rose again, voice firm, commanding attention. Your Honor, the child's statement, paired with the K-9's reaction, provides context that cannot be ignored. This is not theatrical exaggeration. It is fact. The defendant's visible reaction confirms the validity of this chain of events. We request that both the statement and the dog's immediate response be formally noted for the record. Officer Daniels held Rex steady, eyes narrowing slightly at the defendant. Rex is under control. he said, voice low, but he is indicating the person responsible. His training is precise. The child's words triggered that response. There is no error. The gallery whispered in disbelief. Some faces went pale. A few women dabbed at their eyes with tissues. The weight of innocence and instinct combined created a tension no one could ignore. The little girl, meanwhile, sat quietly, almost contemplatively, her small hands folded around the stuffed rabbit. She had no awareness of the power she had just wielded. To her, it was simple. She had said 2 words, and the dog had reacted. End of story. But in reality, that simple act had shattered weeks of preparation, arrogance, and deception. Ray Haskins's breathing became more rapid. His defenses, legal, personal, psychological, crumbled under the simple authority of a toddler's words and a dog's trained instincts. He shifted in his chair, looking at his lawyer, then at the judge, then back at the child and the dog. Panic flickered in his eyes. Langford whispered urgently, shaking his head. "Don't look, Ray. Don't react. Stay calm." But it was too late. The courtroom had seen. The jurors had seen. The press had seen. And the dog Rex was unwavering. Judge Harmon's gavel struck once more, stern and deliberate. Order in the court. But even his voice could not erase the fact. The balance of the trial had shifted irrevocably. The room held its collective breath, aware that the story unfolding before them was extraordinary. Rex's low growl deepened, vibrating through the polished wooden floor. The child's small voice had done what months of legal maneuvering could not. She had focused truth, attention, and instinct on a single point: the defendant. The jury whispered among themselves quietly, their expressions a mix of fascination and unease. Even those who had been skeptical, dismissing the child's presence as absurd, felt the undeniable weight of what had occurred. Dana Cole nodded subtly to Officer Daniels. "Hold him steady," she said softly. "We're almost there." Thor Rex stayed taut but obedient, restrained by the firm grip of his handler. The courtroom collectively waited, suspended between disbelief and revelation. The tension had reached a climax, and everyone could feel it. The moment was charged, electric, a rare intersection of innocence, instinct, and truth. And above all, the little girl sat quietly, unaware of her power, holding her rabbit, watching the dog, and preparing without knowing it to change the course of the trial. The courtroom, already tense, seemed to crack under the weight of what had just happened. A 3-year-old had spoken 2 words, and a highly trained police dog had reacted instantly, pointing directly at the defendant. Gasps and murmurs echoed off the marble walls, swelling into a wave that seemed unstoppable. Eyes darted in every direction, some at the child, some at the dog, and others at the defendant, whose facade of control was now crumbling visibly. Ray Haskins' hands shook as he gripped the defense table, knuckles whitening. His eyes darted nervously between the child, the dog, and the jury. For weeks, he had cultivated an image of confidence, smugness, and intimidation. That image was now in tatters. The smirk that had adorned his face during testimony was gone, replaced by a raw, unguarded panic. His composure, once impenetrable, had dissolved under the weight of the child's simple command and the K-9's unerring response. Gerald Langford, his defense attorney, rose again, voice sharp but tinged with panic. "Your Honor, this is absurd. A toddler cannot be a witness, and a dog cannot serve as evidence. This is manipulation of the court. I demand." Judge Harmon slammed the gavel, silencing the room. "Mr. Langford, sit down. I will not allow interruptions." Langford sat, seething, muttering under his breath. He glanced at Ray, who looked like a man slowly sinking into quicksand, powerless to resist. The jurors' attention had completely shifted. They were no longer listening to the arguments. They were watching the child the dog, and the subtle tension that bound them to the defendant. Rex, the K9, remained taut and alert. Officer Daniels held him firmly, but the dog's body vibrated with barely restrained intensity. Every muscle, every glance, every twitch suggested an unspoken accusation directed at the defendant. The jurors could see it. The spectators could feel it. The air itself seemed to hum with anticipation, a tension so thick it pressed against the chest. Dana Cole, the prosecutor, rose calmly. Her eyes were locked on the defendant. "Your Honor, we request that the record reflect the child's unprompted statement, the dog's immediate reaction, and the defendant's visible response. These elements collectively form a critical aspect of the case." The gallery erupted into quiet whispers, as though trying to reconcile what they had just witnessed with the legal proceedings. Reporters scribbled furiously, already anticipating headlines. Toddler commands K9 in court. Defendant reacts. Phones were held out discreetly, ready to capture the moment, though no cameras were officially allowed. Ray's hands trembled visibly. He leaned toward Langford, whispering urgently, "Do something. This is insane. Stop this." Langford leaned closer, voice low but panicked. "Stay calm. Don't react. Whatever happens, do not give them an excuse." But the advice fell flat. Ray's composure had already fractured. The jury had seen the fear, the twitching fingers, the trembling hands. Even Langford's words could not repair the damage. Thor Rex shifted slightly, muscles flexing, eyes locked unblinkingly on Ray. The growl in his throat was soft but unmistakable, resonating through the courtroom like a warning. Officer Daniels whispered, "Easy, boy, easy." But the tension in the dog's body was unmistakable. This was not aggression. It was identification. A silent, precise signal that had no need for words. The little girl, her gaze fixed on the dog, reached forward slightly, her finger pointing again. "Find him," she whispered once more, this time so softly that some jurors had to lean in to hear. The effect was immediate. Rex stiffened further, pulling slightly against the leash, growl deepening. The jurors leaned forward in unison, captivated, some covering their mouths in awe. The gallery murmured in astonishment. A collective understanding had formed. The child and the dog were aligned, focused, and the defendant's reaction had confirmed the truth in a way no testimony or document could. Langford's face had drained of color. He rose abruptly, hands waving, voice breaking slightly. "Your Honor, this is preposterous. A child and a dog cannot convict my client. You cannot allow this." Judge Harmon's gavel struck again, sharp and final. "Mr. Langford, sit down immediately." Langford sank back into his chair, pale and frustrated. He glanced at Ray, whose wide eyes betrayed his panic. This was no longer a trial in the traditional sense. The proceedings had been overtaken by an extraordinary chain of events, a combination of innocence, instinct, and human reaction that no one could ignore. Dana Cole stepped forward calmly. "Your Honor, the child's statements and the dog's behavior have revealed a truth that cannot be fabricated. The defendant's visible fear and inability to maintain composure corroborate the reaction of both the child and the canine." The jurors were leaning forward, captivated. Some whispered to their neighbors. Others exchanged wide-eyed glances. Every person in the room, from spectators to court staff, felt the charged energy. The courtroom had transformed from a place of procedure to a stage for revelation. Ray Haskins' breathing became shallow. He gripped the table, white-knuckled, fingers trembling. Every instinct screamed at him that he was exposed, that the facade of control had evaporated. He tried to speak, to argue, to assert dominance, but his voice faltered. Words stumbled out, weak and ineffective, drowned by the tension in the room. Rex's growl deepened, resonating from his chest like a low drum. Officer Daniels whispered soft commands, trying to maintain control without breaking the dog's focus. It was delicate; any sudden movement could escalate the situation. But the dog's attention never wavered. The child, still clutching her rabbit, sat upright, her eyes unwavering. She had no understanding of the chaos she had created, no comprehension of the power she wielded. To her, it was simple. Say the words, the dog reacts, and the man across the room looks frightened. Simple cause and effect. The gallery, jurors, and courtroom staff were all caught in a suspended moment. Time seemed to stretch. Each second carried weight, tension, an unspoken acknowledgement that something extraordinary had unfolded. Langford leaned toward Ray one last time, whispering frantically, "Keep calm. Don't react. Don't let them see you panic." Ray shook his head subtly, almost involuntarily, unable to conceal the fear reflected in his eyes. The child's tiny voice, repeating her words, and the dog's unblinking focus left him powerless. Judge Harmon tapped the gavel once more, voice booming. "Order. All witnesses and parties remain calm. This court will proceed." But the order could not dissolve the tension. The jurors were transfixed. The spectators leaned in closer. The reporters scribbled faster than ever. And the defendant, the once confident man, sat frozen in his chair, staring at the child and the dog, stripped of authority and pretense. Rex, muscles taut, growling low, stood as if ready to move, restrained only by the careful hold of his handler. The child's gaze remained calm, serene, almost knowing. In that moment, the courtroom understood something extraordinary had occurred. Truth, innocence, an instinct had converged to expose what reason and argument alone could not. The energy in the room was nearly unbearable. Whispers mingled with stunned silence, breaths held, eyes wide. It was a tableau of revelation, a frozen moment that everyone would remember, the day a toddler and a dog together unveiled the truth no courtroom had ever witnessed. The courtroom was suspended in tense anticipation, the air thick with electricity. Every eye remained fixed on the small child clutching her rabbit, and the German shepherd Rex, whose taut muscles and unwavering gaze seemed to hold the room in thrall. The defendant, Ray Haskins, sat slumped, white-knuckled, staring at the duo with raw panic in his eyes. His confidence, once towering and unshuckable, had evaporated under the quiet authority of innocence paired with instinct. Judge Harmon leaned forward, his expression grave. He had presided over thousands of trials, seen every type of deception, every type of theatrics, and yet nothing in his career had prepared him for this. A 3-year-old and a K9 had collectively unraveled weeks of legal posturing, leaving the truth stark and undeniable. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the judge began, voice steady but firm, "you have witnessed testimony and events that are extraordinary in nature. The child witness has provided information directly relevant to this case. Additionally, the trained K9 officer has exhibited behavior consistent with identifying the individual responsible for the alleged crimes." Hush fell over the gallery. Every spectator, every reporter, every court official waited, suspended in a collective moment of suspense. The jurors sat forward, notebooks abandoned, minds focused entirely on the unfolding reality before them. Dana Cole, the prosecutor, stood calmly. "Your Honor, the facts are clear." The child's words were unprompted. The dog's reaction was immediate and precise. The defendant's visible reaction to these events confirms their validity. We request that the jury consider these events as part of the evidence in their deliberations. Langford's hands trembled as he whispered urgently to Haskins, "Stay calm. This can still be managed." But even he could feel the momentum slipping through his fingers. The jury's attention had shifted irrevocably. They were no longer evaluating arguments or legal rhetoric. They were witnessing truth. Thor Rex stood rigidly beside Officer Daniels, muscles coiled like a spring. The dog's low growl resonated through the room, not menacing, but authoritative. Every juror, every spectator, every court official could feel it, a silent declaration of recognition and truth. The little girl leaned slightly forward, eyes wide, voice soft but deliberate. "Find him," she whispered once more. The words echoed in the courtroom like a command and confirmation simultaneously. Rex shifted slightly, growl intensifying, yet obedient to his handler's steady grip. Every gaze, from the judge to the jury, followed the unspoken communication between child and dog. Ray Haskins' face paled. Sweat glistened on his brow. His hands gripped the table so tightly that the wood creaked. He opened his mouth to speak, to protest, to assert himself, but no words came. He was frozen by the undeniable truth laid bare in front of him. A toddler and a dog had collectively exposed him. Judge Harmon's voice cut through the tension. "Mr. Haskins, do you understand the weight of what has just transpired in this courtroom?" The defendant's lips quivered. He shook his head faintly, unable to form words, eyes darting to the child, then to the dog, then to his defense attorney. The room was silent, save for the occasional shuffle or whisper. Yet the weight of understanding was palpable. The jurors exchanged glances. The magnitude of the events had shifted the trial from mere argument into an undeniable revelation of truth. Some leaned back, shaking their heads in disbelief. Others clasped their hands together, processing the extraordinary evidence presented not in words alone, but in instinct and innocence combined. Langford's face had drained of color. He whispered sharply to Haskins, "Keep calm. Whatever happens, don't react. You." But he was cut off by the sudden, collective intake of breath from the jury. One juror raised her hand tentatively. Another whispered, and soon murmurs spread through the box. The jury had reached consensus. Every member had witnessed the child's words, the canine's reaction, and the defendant's visible panic. No amount of legal argument could undo the reality of what they had seen. Judge Harmon's voice rang out, commanding attention. "The jury has reached a verdict. Will the foreperson please rise?" The foreperson, a woman in her late 40s, rose, eyes steady, voice clear. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Ray Haskins, guilty on all counts as charged." A collective gasp erupted from the gallery. Some spectators applauded quietly. Others shook their heads, murmuring disbelief. Langford's hands clenched the table. Ray's face went pale, mouth opening and closing, unable to respond. Dana Cole allowed herself a brief, controlled smile. Justice, extraordinary in form, had been served. A child, still clutching her rabbit, looked up at the jury, then at the dog, her small face serene, unaware of the monumental impact of her words. Rex remained alert, low growl fading as Officer Daniels patted him lightly, whispering reassurances. The dog's role in the trial was complete, his trained instincts having guided truth to light. Judge Harmon leaned forward, voice calm but firm. "The court thanks the child witness for her presence and the canine officer for his service. This courtroom has witnessed an extraordinary convergence of instinct, innocence, and truth. Let this serve as a reminder that justice can come from unexpected sources." Ray Haskins, finally realizing the magnitude of his defeat, slumped in his chair. He had faced countless challenges, had manipulated situations, and relied on legal expertise, but none of that mattered. In the end, innocence and instinct had unraveled his defenses. Langford shook his head, muttering under his breath, but the courtroom's focus had long since shifted. Eyes were on the child, on the dog, and on the quiet, unstoppable truth they had revealed together. Dana Cole approached the judge quietly. "Your Honor, may we ensure that the child and the dog are recognized appropriately for their contribution? Judge Harmon nodded. Certainly. The record shall reflect their extraordinary role. The child's courage and the canine service have been instrumental in revealing truth. This courtroom acknowledges their contribution. The spectators began to clap softly. Some wiped tears from their eyes, moved by the simplicity and purity of justice achieved. The jurors remained seated briefly, still absorbing the remarkable events. Cameras flashed discreetly, capturing what would undoubtedly become a legendary account of courtroom history. The little girl's guardian rose, scooping her up gently. She whispered something in her ear. The child smiled faintly. Rabbit still clutched tightly, completely unaware of the heroism she had displayed. Officer Daniels patted Rex on the head. The dog's posture relaxed, the tension in his muscles fading. He had done his duty flawlessly, guided not only by training, but by an extraordinary bond of trust and instinct. Ray Haskins was escorted from the courtroom, hands restrained, head bowed. His arrogance had crumbled, replaced by the stark reality of defeat. Justice had arrived in an unexpected, unprecedented form, and there was no escape. Langford trailed behind, silent now, realizing that no legal maneuver could have salvaged the situation. The trial's outcome was sealed not by rhetoric or argument, but by the combination of innocence, instinct, and courage manifested in the smallest and largest witnesses. In the room, a 3-year-old girl and a German shepherd. The gallery slowly emptied, whispers following spectators as they left. The child and her guardian departed last, leaving behind an indelible mark on everyone present. The courtroom had witnessed an event that would be remembered for years. A moment where truth transcended ordinary testimony, and justice, extraordinary in form, prevailed. Judge Harmon leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He had seen many trials, many verdicts, but this one would remain etched in memory. Case adjourned, he said. The gavel fell once more. Outside the courthouse, the sun was setting, casting long shadows on the marble steps. Reporters gathered around, eager to capture the story. Spectators lingered, speaking in hushed, excited tones. And somewhere, in the quiet of a nearby street, the little girl hugged her rabbit, her innocent smile unaware of the extraordinary role she had played. Rex walked proudly beside Officer Daniels, tail high, the unspoken hero of a courtroom that had witnessed a justice unlike any other. In that moment, truth had prevailed. Justice had been served. And all it had taken were 2 words, a child and a loyal canine, to tip the scales irreversibly.